16 years after her daughter disappeared without a trace, Ruth Walker thought she'd finally learned to live with the silence. Then one gray March morning in Atlanta, she bought a storage unit for $150, just trying to find space for old family keepsakes. What she opened instead was a rusted white freezer that smelled of metal and dust, and inside, wrapped in layers of plastic, was the frozen body of her daughter, Alana. Still wearing the medical alert bracelet Ruth had made her promise never to take off. That day every unanswered prayer, every sleepless night came rushing back. The police had called it a runaway case. The city had forgotten, but Ruth hadn't. And now that she'd found her daughter, she was going to make sure someone paid for what they did. 16 years is a long time to carry silence. Long enough for the flyers to fade from telephone poles, for reporters to stop calling, for neighbors to stop asking if you've heard anything new. Long enough for a mother's hope to turn into something harder, sharper, like glass that never quite dulls no matter how many years go by. Ruth Walker had lived inside that silence since the fall of 2008, when her 16-year-old daughter Alana vanished on her way home from Booker T. Washington High, a 10-minute walk, 2 blocks, and then nothing, no witnesses, no video footage, no ransom call. Just an empty sidewalk and a pink backpack found 3 days later in an alley that smelled like rain and gasoline. The police told her she's probably a runaway, the same way they told so many mothers in neighborhoods like hers. Poor, black, working class girls who disappear from these streets don't make the evening news for long. Ruth never believed it. Alana wasn't the kind of girl to run away. She was quiet, thoughtful, the kind who spent her weekends volunteering at the library, the kind who called her mother after school just to say she was on her way home. She was also diabetic type 1, and she never went anywhere without her insulin kit or her silver medical bracelet. Ruth had given her that bracelet when Alana was 12, right after the diagnosis, and she remembered clasping it around her daughter's wrist and whispering, "Promise me I'll never take this off. If something ever happens, this will tell them who you are." Alana had rolled her eyes the way teenagers do, but she'd promised. It was the kind of promise that should have meant nothing until it meant everything. The years after Alana's disappearance passed like slow decay. Ruth worked double shifts as a home nurse, came home to an empty house that still smelled faintly like her daughter's hair oil and bubblegum lotion. Friends stopped visiting. The detectives changed, then retired, and her daughter's case file moved further back in the filing cabinet. She wrote letters to shows, missing persons units, even the governor. Nobody answered. Eventually, she stopped asking for help and started searching on her own. Every abandoned building, every report of an unidentified body, Ruth was there, showing pictures, asking questions. She aged 10 years for every one that passed. By the time she turned 65, her hands trembled when she held her coffee cup, but her eyes were still sharp, alive with something that refused to die. When she decided to sell her house, it wasn't about giving up. The place had too many ghosts, too much noise in the walls. She planned to move into a smaller apartment on the west side, closer to her nephew Marcus. He was the only family who still checked in, the only one who didn't tell her to let it go. Marcus was a construction worker, strong, kind, and patient in the way men raised by black women learned to be. He'd drive her to appointments, fix her car, sit on the porch when the nights got heavy. When he told her about storage auctions, about how she could buy an abandoned unit cheap and use it for her old furniture and photo boxes, Ruth figured it was a good idea. A small, practical decision in a life that hadn't allowed many. That Saturday morning was cold, the kind of damp Atlanta cold that seeps through coats. Ruth wore her old church hat, the one with the purple ribbon, and clutched her purse close as she walked through Peachtree Storage Depot. Surrounded by men who looked like they bought and sold junk for a living. She didn't belong there, but she smiled politely, kept to herself. The auctioneer talked fast, opening each metal door and shouting numbers. When he got to Unit 23, he laughed about the industrial freezer in the back, said it was too damn heavy to move. probably full of spoiled meat. Most people walked away. Ruth didn't care. She wasn't there for the junk, she just needed the space. When the bidding started at 100, she raised her hand at 150. No one else bid, sold. The man handed her a key and a receipt, and just like that, Unit 23 was hers. She didn't open the freezer that day. She figured she'd come back with Marcus once he got off work, move things out slowly. But when she returned the next morning, the air inside the unit was thick and stale, heavy with dust and mold. The freezer sat in the corner like a tomb, its white paint yellowed, its handle stiff with rust. Marcus joked it probably had somebody's Thanksgiving turkey from 1999 still in it. He grinned when he said it, but when he tried to move it, the smile disappeared. The thing wouldn't budge. "Auntie," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead, "this thing's packed with something." Ruth's heart thudded. She didn't know why, just a strange, tight feeling in her chest. She told him to cut the old padlock. The sound of the bolt cutters snapping through the shackle was loud in the small space. When Marcus pried the lid open, the hinges screamed. Cold mist rolled out like breath from another world. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ruth saw it, plastic sheeting, layers of it, and underneath a shape too smooth, too solid. Not meat, not furniture. The air turned colder somehow. Marcus leaned closer, and that's when he saw the wrist. Brown skin, braided hair frozen stiff against the ice. And that bracelet, dull silver, scratched but still readable, Alana Walker, type 1 diabetes. Ruth's knees went weak. The sound that came from her wasn't a scream. Not really, more like the kind of sound a heart makes when it breaks after holding itself together too long. Marcus called 911, his hands shaking so bad he could barely hold the phone. Ruth didn't hear much after that, not the sirens, not the questions, not the neighbors gathering near the yellow tape. All she could see was that bracelet, the same one she had clasped on her daughter's wrist all those years ago. The same one that promised to speak for her if she couldn't. And now, after 16 years of silence, it finally had. When Detective Leon Harris approached her, notebook in hand, Ruth didn't cry. She couldn't. She just looked at him and said, "That's my baby." Harris was a tall, wary-looking man in his 40s, the kind of detective who'd seen too much and believes too little. He tried to keep his voice even, but there was something in his eyes, recognition, maybe guilt. He'd been a rookie back when Alana disappeared. He remembered the case. Remembered how quickly it had been dismissed. "We'll find out what happened, Ms. Walker," he said softly. But Ruth already knew the truth. If she hadn't opened that freezer, Alana would still be lost. Frozen in the dark while the world kept moving on. That night, Ruth sat alone in her living room, lights off, just the hum of the refrigerator in the background. The irony wasn't lost on her. A freezer had hidden her daughter. Another whispered in the dark now. She stared at the photo on the mantel, Alana's bright smile and braided hair. For the first time in 16 years, Ruth didn't pray for her daughter's return. She prayed for justice. Because she understood something the moment she looked into that freezer. The system had failed her. But she wouldn't fail her child. And that was how it began. Not the tragedy that part had started years ago, but the reckoning. The story of a mother who found her child buried in ice and decided to set fire to everything that kept her there. A year before Alana Walker vanished, a man no one really noticed drove into Atlanta on a humid September afternoon. He was the kind of man who blended into the background: khaki jacket, plain ball cap, eyes that never looked up long enough for anyone to remember their color. He pulled a rented U-Haul into Peachtree Storage Depot, signed a lease under the name John Doe, paid 3 months in cash, and told the manager he was storing medical equipment. The manager, a balding man named Vernon, didn't ask questions. People stored all kinds of strange things, their old refrigerators, taxidermy, vending machines, even a coffin once. But what Vernon remembered later, when the police came knocking 16 years after, was the freezer. A long industrial-sized chest model, white with chrome latches, the kind you'd see in restaurant kitchens or hospitals. The man insisted on rolling it into the unit himself. "It's fragile," he'd said. He locked it with a new padlock, double wrapped in chains. After that, he was gone. For months the payments came on time. Always cash, sometimes money orders, mailed from different parts of the city. Then, in 2008, they stopped. Vernon tried calling the number on file, but it was disconnected. Technically, he could have auctioned the unit off after 90 days. But then the payments started again, small amounts, never enough to clear the balance, but enough to keep the account active. The new payments came from different addresses, no names, just envelopes with crumpled bills or money orders and a unit number scrawled on the corner. It was strange, sure, but not unheard of. People fell behind, caught up, fell behind again. Vernon figured someone was just lazy about paying. He didn't know that someone, somewhere, was buying time. The freezer sat untouched for 16 years. Storage facilities are full of secrets like that, silent spaces, rented by the forgotten or the guilty. Every time a new manager took over, they tried to move it, but no one could. Too heavy. Probably full of meat, one of them said. Or tools, another guessed. The truth was darker than either could imagine. The power had been cut long ago, but the seal held tight, the cold trapped inside like a coffin, keeping its own secret. By the time Ruth Walker bought Unit 23, the world had changed, but that freezer hadn't. It waited patient, still locked, still chained. There was something almost defiant about it, like it knew the past wasn't done yet. When the police began tracing the storage unit's history after the discovery, they found a pattern that didn't make sense. The first payment records were linked to a shell company that no longer existed, something called Southern Biologistics, dissolved in 2010. The later payments came from random money orders purchased at convenience stores, gas stations, and check cashing places across Georgia and Alabama. Whoever had been keeping that freezer safe was careful, methodical. It was like watching a ghost move through paper trails. Detective Leon Harris spent a week going through the old ledgers, every crumpled receipt and handwritten log. There was no name, no address that led anywhere real. But there was a rhythm to it. Every 2 or 3 months, a payment. Always just enough. Whoever did it wasn't protecting the contents out of sentiment. It was business. That freezer had value once. Maybe it still did. Meanwhile, Ruth tried to make sense of how something so horrifying could stay hidden in plain sight. How a girl could disappear 2 miles from home, and no one ever think to look there in a metal box, at the edge of the city. She thought about all the storage units she'd driven past on her way to work, neat rows of steel doors under fluorescent lights. Each one a little tome waiting to be opened. She thought about how easy it was to disappear in a city that never really looked for you in the first place. The media came for a few days after the body was found, just enough time to get sound bites and a tragic photo. Missing girl found after 16 years, the headlines read, but they didn't say her name right. Some called her Alana, others Alyssa. A couple of them didn't mention her at all, just woman finds body of missing teen. Ruth watched it all unfold on her old television, the faces of reporters who looked bored by the 5th interview. The city had moved on long ago. For them, it was just another story, something tragic to fill a slow news day. For Ruth, it was the reopening a wound that never healed. Detective Harris came by one evening with a folder under his arm. "We found out who rented the unit," he said. "Or at least, who signed for it. The name's fake, but there's something else." He handed her a photocopy of the original lease. The signature was messy, but one line caught Ruth's eye: "A purpose of storage of medical supplies." He said he was a doctor, Harris continued. Claimed he worked for Atlanta Medical Outreach. That clinic shut down in 2014 after an FBI investigation. Owner was a drawer, Victor Hale. Name ring a bell. Ruth froze. She'd heard that name before. Alana's endocrinologist drew her. Hale, the man who managed her insulin plan, who'd always smiled too wide and said things like, "She's such a strong girl." He'd been kind, polite, professional. She remembered his hands, smooth, pale, ringless. She remembered trusting him. The memory curdled now, sore with dread. He was her doctor, she whispered. Harris nodded slowly, watching her reaction. "That's what we thought." He flipped open the folder. showing her the old clinic's address downtown, near the old industrial park. The FBI shut it down over organ trafficking allegations. Never proved anything. Hale disappeared before they could arrest him. He paused. The freezer might be connected. Ruth's heart hammered so hard she could barely breathe. She stared at the folder, at the cold black letters of the clinic's name. The words didn't fit together in her mind. Doc Clinic, daughter, freezer. But they did, didn't they? They fit too well. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every sound in her house seemed louder: the creak of pipes, the hum of the fridge, the clock ticking too fast. She sat at her kitchen table with the folder Harris had left, reading the same pages over and over. Alana Medical Outreach, it said. Founded 2005, specializing in transplant research. There were names of doctors, donors, grants, all clean on paper. But between the lines, Ruth saw something else. A place that could hide behind the language of healing while doing the opposite. She tried to remember every visit, every moment Alana had with Hale. The appointments were always short. He never let Ruth come in the exam room. Teenagers need privacy, he'd said, especially when it comes to chronic conditions. Back then, she'd believed him. Now, she wondered what else he'd said to Alana when she wasn't there. Whether he'd seen something in her, not her kindness, not her future, but her organs, her youth, her value in a darker kind of market. By dawn, Ruth had made up her mind. She wasn't waiting for the police to dig through more files. 16 years had taught her one thing: when the system forgets a black girl, her mother has to remember louder. She packed a flashlight, a pair of gloves, and her old cell phone. She was going to find that clinic. The next morning, she drove downtown, past the cracked sidewalks and boarded storefronts that used to hum with life. The address from Harris's folder led her to a squat concrete building surrounded by chain link fence. The sign was still faintly visible: Alana Medical Outreach, closed by federal order. The doors were boarded, but someone had already pried them open years ago. The inside smelled of mildew and chemicals. Ruth moved through the hallways slowly, her flashlight beam slicing through dust. Examination rooms, storage closets, a surgery suite stripped bare. But there was something about the place: the drains in the floor, the cold echo of her footsteps, that made her skin crawl. She almost turned back until she saw the papers in the corner of a rusted filing cabinet. Old records, water damaged, half rotted. She flipped through them carefully. Most were illegible, but one page caught her eye: a chart labeled Full Harvest. The date September 12, 2008. The same day Alana disappeared, and next to it a note written in faded ink: subject of you. Type 1 organs viable, payment received. Her vision blurred. The room seemed to tilt. Ruth pressed the page against her chest and tried not to scream. She didn't need a detective or a DNA test to tell her what it meant. She'd found her daughter's grave once already. Now she'd found the paperwork that sold her. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the broken windows. Somewhere far away, sirens wailed: a city still alive, still moving, unaware that in one of its forgotten corners, a mother had just unearthed the truth it buried 16 years ago. Ruth Walker woke up the next morning with a kind of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The police had taken her statement, they'd taped off the storage unit, and the local news had already moved on to another tragedy somewhere else in the city. But Ruth couldn't move on. Not now, not after she'd seen what 16 years of silence looked like, packed in ice and wrapped in plastic. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the cup of coffee she'd made an hour earlier. The surface had gone cold and oily. Across from her, the morning paper was open to a half-page article: body found in storage unit, identified as missing, teen from 2008. The rest of the story was all facts, no feeling. No mention of who Alana was, what she loved, how she laughed, how she used to hum gospel songs while brushing her hair before school. The world had reduced her daughter to a headline and a body. Ruth wasn't going to let that be the last word. The house felt too small, too still. Boxes were stacked against the walls, ready for her move to the new apartment. She'd planned to take it slow, one room at a time. But now, every object felt like an anchor to a life that had already ended. She picked up one of Alana's photo frames, the one from her 15th birthday, cake half eaten. Cheeks full of light, and held it for a long moment before setting it gently into a cardboard box. "I found you, baby," she whispered. "But I ain't done yet." Marcus came by around 9, knocking softly before letting himself in. He looked worn out, eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. "You eat anything, Auntie?" he asked, glancing around the cluttered kitchen. Ruth shook her head. He sighed, started rummaging through her fridge, muttering about how she couldn't live on coffee and grief. He was trying to keep things normal, but there was no normal left. Not after what they'd seen. When he finally sat down across from her, 2 plates of scrambled eggs between them, Ruth said quietly, "We going back there?" Marcus looked up, fork frozen halfway to his mouth. "To the unit, yeah," she said. "I need to see it again." Marcus wanted to argue, but he knew that tone in her voice. The one that meant she'd already made up her mind. They drove back to Peachtree Storage Depot just after noon. The place looked the same, gray metal doors lined up like silent witnesses, yellow tape still stretched across Unit 23. A police officer sat in his car near the entrance, windows rolled down, eating chips. He barely glanced at them when they pulled up. Ruth stepped out, feeling the cool bite of the March air on her face. The lot smelled like rain and rust. She could almost hear the echoes of the auctioneer's voice, the louder when people joked about the heavy freezer. If only they'd known. She stood in front of the taped-off door and closed her eyes. The image of the freezer flashed behind her eyelids, the white lid, the frost, the glint of the bracelet. Marcus stood beside her in silence. After a moment, she said, "I should be looked everywhere back then. Every warehouse, every dump, her voice cracked. I didn't look here. My baby was right here." Marcus put a hand on her shoulder. "You couldn't have known," he said. "Nobody could be." Ruth shook her head. "Somebody knew. Somebody paid to keep her hidden." When the officer finally approached them, Ruth asked if she could go inside, just for a moment. He said no, of course it was still an active crime scene. But he softened when he saw her face. "Ma'am, they were almost done processing. I think they were wrapping up today," he said quietly. "You should talk to Detective Harris tomorrow. He's the one leading it." Ruth thanked him and walked back to the car, but her mind was already racing. Tomorrow was too far away. She'd spent 16 years waiting. She wasn't waiting another day. That night, she pulled out the old folder again, the one Harris had shown her with the clinic's address. Atlanta Medical Outreach. The place had been closed for years, but maybe there was still something inside. Something that could tell her who'd done this and why. She thought about all those years when people told her to let go, to move on, to make peace. Peace was for people who got answers. She'd gotten none. She slipped the folder into her purse, along with a small flashlight, her phone, and a canister of pepper spray Marcus had bought her after the break in last year. The streets of Atlanta were mostly empty by the time she reached the old industrial district. The clinic sat between 2 abandoned warehouses, its windows boarded, its parking lot cracked with weeds. The faded blue sign still hung above the entrance at Atlanta Medical Outreach. Compassion, innovation, care. The words made her stomach turn. She parked a block away, killed the engine, and sat in the silence for a long moment. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from the weight of what she was about to do. Then she got out and started walking. The back door of the clinic had been pried open years ago. Inside, the air was thick with mildew. The halls smelled of dust and something metallic underneath. Her footsteps echoed as she moved past rooms with broken glass and overturned equipment. Most of the rooms were empty, but one still had a metal table bolted to the floor, a single overhead light dangling by its wire. The sight made her stomach twist. She forced herself to keep moving. Down another hall, she found what looked like an office. Papers littered the floor. She crouched down and began to sift through them, careful not to tear the damp pages. That's when she found a thin folder marked Harvest Schedule. Most of the papers were ruined, but one page was still legible. The date stopped her heart, September 12, 2008. The column beside it listed a series of initials and notes. One line read to subject of due, type 1 full harvest complete. Ruth stared at it until the letters blurred. The air seemed to vanish around her. Her knees hit the floor. She clutched the paper to her chest and whispered, "Oh my God." The sound of footsteps pulled her back, slow, deliberate, coming from down the hall. Ruth froze, her heart pounding so loud she thought it might give her away. The beam of a flashlight swept across the wall. A man's voice muttered something in Spanish. Ruth ducked behind the desk, holding her breath. The man entered the room, medium build, Latino, wearing gloves and a windbreaker. He began rummaging through the same piles of paper she had just searched. "Where is it?" he hissed under his breath. His voice was tight with frustration. Ruth's hands shook so badly she had to press them against her mouth to stay silent. After a few tense minutes, he gave up, cursing softly before leaving the room. Ruth waited until the footsteps faded, then peeked out. He was gone. She slipped out of the office, moving as quietly as she could. When she reached the back door, she risked a glance outside and saw a black Honda parked near the alley. She raised her phone, snapped a photo of the license plate, then ran to her car. Her heart didn't stop racing until she was miles away. At home, she called Detective Harris. "It's Ruth Walker," she said, her voice trembling. "I found something at that clinic." He didn't sound pleased. "You went there alone?" "I had to," she said sharply. "And I found proof of record from the day my daughter disappeared. It says subject full harvest complete. And there was a man there searching for something. I got his license plate." There was a long silence on the line. Then Harris said, "Text me the photo. Stay home. Don't go anywhere. I'll call you when we have something." She hung up, her hand still shaking, and sent the photo. The man's car was burned into her memory, the black Honda, the dented bumper, the Georgia plates. She didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house made her flinch. Every shadow looked like someone standing in the corner. By morning, her phone rang. It was Harris. "We got a hit," he said. "The car belongs to a man named Luz Romero. Used to work construction, but records show he did contract maintenance for Atlanta Medical Outreach between 2007 and 2009. He paused. "Ms. Walker, I think you may have found the person who's been paying for that storage unit." Ruth felt something cold and electric crawl up her spine. "Then find him," she said. Her voice was low, steady. "Find him before I do." She ended the call and sat back in her chair, the thin morning light filtering through the blinds. On the table in front of her lay the crumpled record from the clinic, its faded ink still legible. It was more than evidence. It was the truth she'd been searching for, written in the same language her city had used to erase her daughter. Codes, dates, numbers. But behind those letters, she could see Alana's face. And she swore, right there in that quiet kitchen, that she would not rest until every person behind those initials paid for what they did. Detective Leon Harris didn't waste time once the photo hit his inbox. The license plate led him to a small, one-story house on the edge of East Point, a tired-looking neighborhood where yards were mostly dirt, and every other porch had a broken swing. When he and two uniforms knocked on the door, it took nearly 5 minutes before anyone answered. The man who finally opened it fit Ruth's description exactly: mid-40s, Latino, dark circles under his eyes, smelling faintly of motor oil and cigarette smoke. "Luz Romero?" Harris asked. The man's face twitched. "Who's asking?" "Atlanta PD." The color drained from Romero's cheeks. Within seconds, he was cuffed and seated in the back of a squad car, staring straight ahead, not saying a word. Ruth found out later that afternoon when Harris called. "We've got him," he said. "Romero's in custody." She didn't ask how or where. She just whispered, "Good." Harris's tone softened. "He's talking, Ms. Walker. It might take some time, but I'll let you know what we learn." That night, Ruth sat on her couch, lights off, listening to the hum of the city outside. She tried not to imagine what was being said in that interrogation room, but she couldn't stop herself. Somewhere, a man was explaining how her daughter had ended up in that freezer, and for the first time, the not knowing might finally end. In the gray, windowless interview room at the precinct, Louis Romero slumped in a chair across from Harris, hands trembling. His lawyer sat beside him, silent and grim. On the table sat a stack of photos, the storage unit, the freezer, the bracelet. Romero couldn't look at them. "You worked for Atlanta Medical Outreach," Harris began. Romero nodded. "I did maintenance. Cleaning, deliveries, whatever they needed, and you knew Juror Victor Hale?" "Yeah," Romero said, rubbing his wrists. "Everyone did. He ran the place." "And what about Jutramila Novak?" The name made him flinch. "She was the surgeon. Russian or something. Cold, never looked at you unless she had to. Tell me about the freezer." Romero's breathing quickened. "I didn't kill nobody," he said quickly. "I swear I didn't." Harris leaned forward, voice calm but unyielding. "Then tell me what you did." It came out in fragments at first, then faster once the dam broke. Romero had been hired in 2007 to drive donors to the clinic, young people, mostly from poor neighborhoods. Hale called them subjects for medical research. He told Romero they were volunteers, paid for their time. But after a few months, Romero realized the truth. He overheard Hale and Novak talking about fresh tissue, about preservation time. He saw blood on the floor one morning, more than any research study could explain. When he asked questions, Hale told him to shut up if he wanted to keep breathing. "They said if I ever talked, my family'd disappear next," Romero said, voice cracking. "I had a wife then, 2 little girls. I did what they told me." When Harris slid a photo of Alana across the table, Romero's eyes filled with tears. "You remember her?" the detective asked. Romero nodded. "Yeah, I picked her up." The words hung heavy in the air. "When?" "September 2008. They gave me an address near Cascade Avenue. Told me there was a gas leak in the area. Said to tell folks to evacuate the street. They even gave me a fake utility vest, clipboard, the whole thing. I saw her walking alone. She looked like a kid. I told her she needed to get in the van, just for a few minutes, till it was safe." He rubbed his face with both hands. "She believed me." Harris felt a chill crawl up his spine. "And you drove her to the clinic?" Romero nodded again. "Dropped her off with Novak. She took her inside. I never saw the girl again." He swallowed hard. "A few hours later, Hale gave me a package to get rid of, said it was medical waste. Told me to take it to the storage unit and leave it there. When I got there, I realized it was heavy. Too heavy. I opened it and saw the plastic." His voice faltered. "I locked it and left. I told myself I didn't see nothing." Hale said he'd handle the payments. But after the clinic shut down, he started sending me cash every few months. Told me to keep the unit open just in case. I didn't even want to touch the money, but he said if I didn't, he'd make sure people found out what was in there and say it was me. In another room of the same building, Ruth sat waiting with a cup of cold water. Harris had promised to brief her once Romero finished his statement. The walls buzzed with low voices, phones ringing, footsteps. She felt detached from it all, like the world around her was happening underwater. When Harris finally entered, his face was grim but focused. "He confessed," he said. "Not to killing her. He claims he didn't do that. But he admits he took her and delivered her to Hale and Novak. Says they were running an organ trafficking operation out of the clinic." Ruth didn't react at first. She stared at the tiled floor, the cracks between them. Then she said quietly, "Did he say why her?" Harris hesitated. "Because she was healthy. Because her organs were worth money." Something inside Ruth hardened, like concrete setting. She'd known pain before, but not this kind, the kind that came with knowing exact how evil could wear a doctor's smile. Harris told her there would be formal charges, that the department would coordinate with the FBI, that they might even reopen old missing persons cases tied to the clinic. She nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere. She saw Alana's face, saw the gentle eyes that once looked up at her from across the kitchen table. And she saw Hale's hands, pale and clean, taking notes at every appointment. She'd trusted him with her daughter's life. He'd taken it instead. Romero's confession cracked open a case that had been cold for over a decade. Federal agents descended on the precinct within 24 hours. They had their own files, old surveillance from 2014. Evidence seized from the raid that had never been used because Hale vanished before they could charge him. There were whispers of missing medical records, donors who were never donors, organ shipments routed through shell charities. The more they found, the worse it became. Hale hadn't just killed Alana. There were others. 12 names, 12 children from across Georgia and Alabama, all vanished between 2007 and 2009. Some poor, some runaway, some simply forgotten. The FBI traced the payments Romero received to a web of accounts tied to offshore banks. Money moved through charities, fake clinics, and medical supply companies. Each layer made it harder to follow. But one address kept popping up: a P.O. box in Tampa, Florida, registered under the name Robert Chase. The handwriting on the forms matched the old lease at Peachtree Storage. Hale was still out there, living under another name. Ruth wasn't supposed to know all that, but Harris told her anyway. He said she deserved the truth, even if it came in pieces. "We were working with federal authorities," he said. "We'll find him." Ruth met his eyes. "You'd better," she said quietly. "Because if you don't, I will." That night when she got home, she opened Alana's old room. Everything was just as it had been the day she disappeared: books on the shelf, a half-finished sketch on the desk, a bottle of perfume that still smelled faintly of vanilla and youth. Ruth sat on the bed, holding the medical bracelet the police had returned to her earlier that day. The metal was cold against her skin, etched with words that had outlasted the child who wore them. Alana Walker, type 1 diabetes. She turned it over in her hand, tracing the letters with her thumb. It wasn't just a bracelet anymore. It was a testimony. Proof that even when the world stopped listening, something small and silver had remembered her. Outside, sirens wailed somewhere far away. Atlanta kept breathing, kept living, as if nothing had happened. But Ruth knew better. Her city was full of ghosts, girls whose names were never printed in the papers. Mothers who still waited for calls that would never come. She looked at the bracelet again and whispered, "You re-home now, baby. But they're not done paying." She placed it on the nightstand, next to the framed photo of Alana smiling in her school uniform, and turned off the light. In the darkness, she could still see the freezer, still hear the crack of the lock breaking open, still feel the rush of air that had escaped after 16 frozen years. It wasn't just cold air that came out that day. It was truth, raw, ugly, unstoppable, and Ruth knew it was only the beginning. By the time the sun climbed over Atlanta again, the case had already shifted from local tragedy to federal investigation. News vans camped outside the police station, their microphones reaching like hungry mouths toward anyone who looked like they might have answers. Detective Leon Harris hated that kind of attention. It always meant people cared more about spectacle than truth. He spent the early morning hours in his office, going over Romero's statement again, trying to find the thread that tied everything together. Every time he read the name Dar Victor Hale, a chill crept up his spine. The man had been a ghost for nearly a decade, vanishing just days before the FBI raided his clinic in 2014. Back then, the DEAT suspected him of running an illegal organ procurement network under the guise of medical outreach. But no one had been able to prove it. Records disappeared, witnesses backed out, and evidence somehow got misplaced. Now, with Alana Walker's body, that silence was broken. Harris reached for the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years, an old contact at the borough, Special Agent Karen Duval. She answered on the third ring, sharp and steady as ever. "Duval, it's Harris," he said. "We've got a problem that's about to be yours." When he told her the details, there was a long pause on the other end. Then she said, "You retelling me Hale's still alive? Looks that way. And the body, 15-year-old cold case, belonged to a girl he treated. Jesus Christ." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "All right, I'll send a team." Ruth didn't know any of this when Harris called her later that day. His voice was quieter than usual, measured. "We need to talk about your daughter's autopsy," he said. The word itself hit her like a slap. Autopsy. She hadn't let herself think about it, not in those terms. The body in the freezer had been her child, frozen in time, still 16, still wearing that bracelet. The idea of someone cutting her open again felt like another betrayal, but she needed to know. "Tell me," she said. They met at the station, in a small room that smelled of stale coffee and paper. Harris had a folder in front of him. He didn't open it right away. "The medical examiner finished her report," he said carefully. "Alana's cause of death wasn't exposure or suffocation. It was surgical trauma." Ruth frowned. "What does that mean?" Harris hesitated, then pushed the folder toward her. Inside were photos she couldn't bear to look at, but the words were enough. "Her organs were removed," he said softly. "Her liver, kidneys, heart. The cuts were clean, made by someone with medical training. The freezer preserved the body within hours of death." Ruth stared at the page, her mind struggling to keep up. "They cut her open," she said slowly, like an animal." Harris nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "We believe she was killed for her organs. We found traces of sedatives in her system. She was unconscious when it happened. She didn't suffer." Ruth's breath came out shaky, her hands trembling in her lap. "That's supposed to make me feel better," she whispered. The detective didn't answer. He'd seen grief before, raw, messy, loud, but what he saw on Ruth's face was quieter and far more dangerous. It was fury, cold and focused. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steady. "You said Hale's clinic got shut down years ago. Who else worked with him?" Harris exhaled. "We were still looking into that. There was a second doctor, a surgeon named Darmila Novak. She disappeared after the raid. We think she and Hale were partners." "You think or you know?" Ruth shot back. "Because if you don't, I will." Harris gave her a look that was equal parts respect and warning. "Don't do that. I'm serious, Ruth. These people are dangerous." She leaned forward, eyes fierce. "And they already killed my daughter. What more can they do?" He wanted to argue, but there was something unshockable in her voice. So he gave her what little information he could, the last known address for the clinic's owner, the details of the FFBA raid, even a copy of an old news article about Hale's disappearance. Ruth read every word like scripture. She learned that Hale had graduated from Emory University with honors, opened his clinic in 2005 with grant money meant to serve low-income patients, and vanished in 2014 after the FBI found evidence of unauthorized surgeries. They'd suspected he was using patients' medical records to match organs with wealthy buyers. But by the time they raided the facility, Hale was gone. Some said he fled overseas. Others thought he'd changed his name. The only thing certain was that he had help. That night, Ruth sat at her kitchen table again, the folder open in front of her, her laptop glowing softly in the dark. She typed drawer Victor Hale Atlanta into the search bar. The results were endless old news clippings, archived press releases, photos from charity galas. In every picture, he looked the same: immaculate suit, calm smile, the kind of man people trusted. She clicked through each link, her stomach turning tighter with every new discovery. There were articles about the raid, about the missing files, about the case being closed due to insufficient evidence. There was one quote from an FBI spokesperson that made her blood run cold. While we cannot confirm criminal wrongdoing, we believe rather Hale's disappearance is voluntary and unrelated to the investigation." Ruth leaned back in her chair, staring at the words. Voluntary. Unrelated. The system had let him vanish, just like it had let her daughter disappear. She didn't realize how long she'd been digging, until the first light of dawn crept through the blinds. That's when she found a small post on a medical forum from 2017. A doctor named Robert Chase had been offering private consultations in Tampa, Florida. The photo attached to the post was blurry, but the jawline, the eyes, they were the same. Older, maybe grayer, but unmistakable. She took a screenshot and saved it to her phone. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She didn't call Harris, not yet. She wanted to be sure. The next morning, she drove to the public library and printed the photo, then placed it next to the old newspaper clipping from 2008. The resemblance was undeniable. She stared at the two faces for a long time, her pulse steadying into resolve. "I found you," she murmured. The words tasted like steel. Back at the precinct, Harris was already coordinating with the bureau. When Ruth showed him the photo, he frowned. "You shouldn't be doing this," he said. But his tone wasn't anger, it was disbelief. He knew she'd found something real. "I'm sending this to Duval," he said, pulling out his phone. "If this is Hale, we'll get a warrant." Ruth folded her arms. "Then move fast. Because if I get to him first, I won't need one." That afternoon, Harris held a press conference. The air was thick with humidity and flashbulbs. "We are reopening the case of Drazara. Victor Hale," he announced. "This is now a joint investigation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Reporters shouted questions. Was it true the clinic had been harvesting organs? How many victims were there? Harris didn't answer. The truth was still forming, still too fragile to expose. Ruth watched it all from home, the TV flickering in her dim living room. The world was finally paying attention, but it felt hollow. The cameras would move on again soon, the way they always did. She looked down at her hands, rough, scarred, shaking, and thought of Alana's. The way they used to fit into hers, small and warm. "I'm coming for him, baby," she said quietly. "I promise." Outside, the sky broke open with rain. It beat against the windows like restless fingers. Somewhere in Florida, a man who once called himself a healer was living under a false name. Probably still practicing medicine. Still smiling at patients with that same calm confidence. Ruth didn't know when she would face him. But she knew this much: he'd taken everything from her. And she was ready to take it back. The freezer had given her the truth. Now she was going to give it teeth. Ruth Walker had never thought of herself as brave. Survival, yes, she'd done that her whole life. Raising a daughter alone in Atlanta, working double shifts as a home nurse, surviving bills, landlords, and the slow violence of being unseen. But bravery, that belonged to other people. Still, the night she drove back to the clinic on the south side of town, flashlight and pepper spray in her purse. She knew she was stepping into something most people would run from. She didn't go out of curiosity. She went because she couldn't breathe, not knowing what else that place had buried. The authorities were still processing paperwork, chasing warrants, waiting for the wheels of justice to turn. Ruth had already spent 16 years waiting. Every minute they took felt like another insult to her daughter's name. The building looked worse this time. The sign was half gone, a few letters dangling from their bolts like broken teeth. The air reeked of mildew and something older: metal, decay, secrets. She parked far enough away not to draw attention and slipped inside through the same side door she'd used before. Her footsteps echoed in the dark hallway. The flashlight beam danced over peeling paint and warped tile. Somewhere above, a pipe dripped steadily, counting time like a metronome. She kept moving. The office where she'd found Alana's record was as she'd left it, except now the papers were scattered wider, the drawers pulled out. Someone had been there since her last visit. Her chest tightened. Maybe the man she'd seen before Romero had come back, or maybe someone else was cleaning up what was left. She crouched down, picking through the mess. Most of the pages were waterlogged, ink bled into meaningless swirls, but one file folder caught her eye. It had the logo of a pharmaceutical company embossed in the corner: Mid-Axis Research Group. Inside were invoices, shipments labeled biological material, dates from 2008 and 2009, recipient addresses in Miami and Houston. Her pulse quickened. These weren't small-time operations, they were networks. She took photos of every page with her phone. A noise from the hall froze her in place. A faint creak, soft but deliberate. She turned off the flashlight and held her breath. The sound came closer, footsteps, slow, cautious. She could hear the scrape of a shoe on tile, the whisper of fabric. Then a voice, low and female, with a sharp Eastern European accent. "I told you to get everything. Why is this still here?" Another voice answered, male, nervous. "I tried Juggernaut, but the place is falling apart. Half the files are gone." "Then find them," she snapped. "The police will come back. I'm not spending my life in prison because you can't do your job." Ruth pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might echo. The woman's name hung in the air like a curse: Dromila Novak. She was real, not just a name in a folder. The sound of boots moved closer, stopping just outside the office. Ruth could see a shadow through the cracked doorway, tall, slender, the beam of a flashlight sweeping the floor. "What about Hale?" the man asked. "He's safe," Novak replied coldly, "in Florida, but not for long if this mess isn't cleaned up." She took a few steps inside. Ruth's fingers tightened around the pepper spray in her pocket. If Novak turned her head another inch, she'd see her. Before that could happen, a crash echoed from deeper in the building, metal hitting concrete. Novak swore under her breath. "Idiot! Go check that noise." The man obeyed, hurrying away. Novak followed halfway down the hall, cursing softly in another language. Ruth saw her chance. She slipped out the opposite door, moving as quietly as she could. The hallway ahead was narrow, leading to a stairwell. Her shoes scuffed once on the dusty floor, and she froze, but no one called out. She climbed the stairs, taking them two at a time, until she reached a small lab on the second floor. There were stainless steel tables, broken microscopes, and a filing cabinet half pulled open. Inside the cabinet were photographs, dozens of them. Medical images, charts, and some that were clearly personal. Faces of young people, mostly black or brown, all labeled with patient numbers and notes. She flipped through them, her stomach churning. Alana's face appeared halfway through the stack, smiling, unaware, a school photo printed on clinic stationery. Beneath it, someone had scrawled in blue ink, "Type 1 viable." Ruth's vision blurred. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, she took a picture of every photo, every name. She wanted to burn the place down, but evidence would speak louder than flames. Then she heard voices again, closer this time. "I heard something upstairs," the man shouted. Novak's reply came sharper, angrier. "Then go deal with it!" Ruth shoved the photos back and ducked behind the table. The footsteps grew louder, echoing up the stairwell. She could see the glow of a flashlight bouncing against the walls. The man entered first, muttering to himself. His light swept across the floor, pausing on the cabinet. "Looks like someone's been here," he said. Ruth didn't wait. She lunged from behind the table, slamming the pepper spray into his face. He screamed, dropping the flashlight. The beam rolled across the floor, cutting wild shadows through the room. Ruth ran. She tore down the hall, past broken doors and cracked glass, until she burst through an emergency exit and into the night. Her lungs burned, her legs trembling. Behind her, Novak's voice echoed in the distance, "Find her." Ruth didn't look back. She sprinted toward her car, fumbling with the keys, heart hammering in her throat. When the engine finally roared to life, she sped off, tires screeching against the cracked pavement. She didn't stop until she reached Marcus's house. He opened the door in shock when he saw her. "Auntie, what the hell happened to you?" She was shaking, covered in dust, eyes wild. "She's alive," Ruth gasped. "The woman Dar Novak, she's alive. I saw her." Marcus blinked. "You sure?" "I heard her voice. She said Hale's in Florida." She pulled out her phone, showing him the photos she'd taken, the invoices, the faces, Alana's picture. "This is proof," she said, her voice trembling. "They didn't just kill my baby. They killed others." Marcus looked through the photos, his expression hardening. "We need to go to Harris." Ruth nodded. "We will. But I want her found first. She's cleaning up. She knows they close." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of what she'd just escaped settling between them. Outside, the city hummed as if nothing had changed, but Ruth knew everything had. She'd looked into the face of the woman who'd stolen her daughter's life and walked away. That kind of moment didn't end, it lived in your blood, reshaping who you were. By dawn, Ruth and Marcus were back at the precinct. Harris listened to every word, his face tightening as Ruth described Novak's voice, her conversation about Hale, the invoices, the photos. "You shouldn't have gone there alone," he said, but his voice was full of all more than anger. "You might have just cracked the whole thing." He sent the photos to the bureau immediately. Within hours, Duval's team had confirmed the Midaxis connection, one of Hale's shell companies, still registered in Florida under an alias. Novak's voice on Ruth's phone recording matched an old interview from the FBI's 2014 file. It was enough to put them both back on the grid. As the day wore on, Ruth sat outside the precinct, watching the traffic flow by, the sky heavy with clouds. For the first time in 16 years, she felt something close to control. She'd spent half her life begging people to care, to look, to believe her daughter mattered. Now, finally, the truth had teeth, and it was biting back. She reached into her purse and touched the bracelets still wrapped in tissue paper. The metal was warm from her hand. "I saw her, baby," she whispered, "and I'm not done yet." That night, long after she'd gone home, Detective Harris stared at the evidence board in his office. He'd pinned up the photos Ruth had taken, the invoices, the names, the face of G.R. Novak. Beneath them, he'd written 2 words in red marker: "No more hiding." He didn't know yet how far the rot went, how many lives Hale's network had swallowed. But one thing was certain: Ruth Walker had done in one night what half a dozen agencies hadn't managed in years. She had found the thread. All they had to do now was pull. The night after Ruth's narrow escape from the clinic, the sky over Atlanta felt thick and swollen, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Rain started sometime after midnight, tapping softly against her apartment windows. She sat on the couch with Marcus beside her, both too wired to sleep. The glow of her phone screen cast pale light across their faces as she scrolled through the photos. She'd taken the invoices, the faces, the scrawled names. Each image was another piece of proof, another reason she couldn't stop. Marcus tried to convince her to rest. "You already did more than anyone else ever could," he said quietly. "Let the cops handle it now." Ruth didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the photo of Alana's face printed on the clinic form, the word "viable" scribbled beneath it in cold blue ink. Finally, she said, "You know what happens when you hand a black girl's death to the system. They file it, they fumble it, and then they forget it." Her voice was soft, but the edge in it was sharp enough to cut. Across town, Detective Harris was still awake too. His office smelled like burnt coffee and exhaustion. The case board behind him was covered in photos: Alana, Hale, Novak, Romero, the clinic. The web of red string looked like veins, connecting a body of lies. He stared at it, trying to find a pulse. The bureau was officially taking over in the morning, which meant he'd soon be sidelined. Just another local cop who'd stumbled onto something too big. He didn't care about credit, but he cared about Ruth. He'd seen too many mothers fade into silence after losing a child, but she was different. Her grief had turned into motion, relentless and unstoppable. Somewhere deep down, Harris felt that same fury at a system that measured justice by headlines and paperwork. By sunrise, his phone buzzed. Agent Duval's voice came through the line, brisk and controlled. "We traced Novak's burner phone," she said. "Pings from an old warehouse near Marietta. We're resetting up surveillance, but we can't move in until we have confirmation she's there." Harris straightened. "You need me." There was a pause. "Officially, no," Duval said. "Unofficially, you didn't hear this from me." The call ended, and Harris sat for a long moment before grabbing his coat. Back in Ruth's apartment, Marcus was pacing the floor. "If they know where she is, why aren't they arresting her?" he asked. Ruth didn't look up from her coffee. "Because they don't care enough yet," she said. "They'll wait till she runs again. Then it'll be another excuse." She stood and grabbed her purse. "We were going." Marcus froze. "You were kidding, right?" "No," she said simply. "She's close. You think I'm going to sit here while they take their time?" Marcus ran a hand down his face. "You were gonna get yourself killed." Ruth slipped the bracelet into her pocket. "Then I'll die doing something that matters." The drive to Marietta was silent except for the hum of the engine and the sound of Ruth's steady breathing. The industrial district was half-abandoned rows of warehouses, the kind of place that looked like it had forgotten its own name. The address Harris had mentioned in passing came up on her GPS as a squat building with boarded windows and a faded sign that once read Southern Biomedical Storage. The parking lot was empty except for a single black SUV near the side entrance. Ruth parked 2 blocks away, her heart beating slow and hard. "You stay here," she told Marcus. "If anything happens, you drive straight to the police." Marcus shook his head. "No way I'm letting you go in alone." She looked at him, her eyes firm. "I need you alive. One of us has to make it out if things go bad." Something in her tone made him stop arguing. Inside the warehouse, the air smelled of bleach and damp wood. The faint hum of electricity came from somewhere deeper in the building. Ruth moved quietly, her shoes making soft sounds against the concrete floor. She followed the noise until she reached a half-open door. Light spilled through the crack, and voices drifted out, two people arguing. She recognized the first voice immediately, Novak. The second was a man's, low, impatient. "I told you to stay quiet," Novak snapped. "And I told you to clean it up," the man replied. "If they find any of those files." "They won't," she cut in. "I burned most of them." "What about the woman?" he asked. "The one from the news, the mother." Ruth's breath caught. "She won't be a problem," Novak said coldly. "People like her always think they can fight the system. They scream, then they disappear. We'll make sure she disappears again." Ruth's blood went cold. For a moment, she couldn't move. The man's voice came closer to the door. She peeked through the crack and saw him. Jeter Victor Hale. Older, grayer, but unmistakable. His once charming smile was gone, replaced by the hard lines of a man who'd spent years running. He was packing medical files into a briefcase while Novak paced behind him, her blonde hair pulled back tight. Ruth's vision tunneled. There he was. The man who'd touched her daughter's wrist, who'd called himself a healer while preparing to butcher her. She didn't remember opening the door, but suddenly she was inside, the pepper spray clutched in her hand. "Don't move," she said. Her voice didn't sound like her own. Novak froze mid-step. Hale turned slowly, disbelief flickering across his face before twisting into something like piety. "Mrs. Walker," he said smoothly, as if greeting an old acquaintance. "I was wondering when you'd come." Ruth's hand trembled, but she didn't back down. "You took my child," she said. "You killed her." Hale sighed. "That's a harsh word for what happened. You wouldn't understand the kind of work we were doing, don't you dare." She cut in. "Don't you dare say her name with that mouth." Novak took a step forward, eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't have come here." Ruth aimed the spray directly at her. "Try me." Hale raised a hand, trying to calm the room. "No one needs to get hurt. I can help you, Ruth. I can make this easier." His voice was honey and poison all at once. Ruth almost laughed. "Easier? You think there's anything easy about what you did?" That's when Marcus burst through the door. He'd waited 5 minutes outside before his nerves got the better of him. When he saw Ruth facing two people with murder in their eyes, he didn't hesitate. "Get away from her," he shouted, swinging a length of pipe he'd picked up from the floor. Novak lunged toward him, pulling a small pistol from her coat. Ruth didn't think. She raised the pepper spray and blasted her full in the face. Novak screamed, stumbling back, the gun clattering to the ground. Hale tried to run, but Marcus tackled him, both of them crashing into a metal table that collapsed under their weight. The chaos was deafening. Ruth kicked the gun away, grabbing her phone to call Harris. "Marietta warehouse," she shouted. "They're here." Both of them. In the background, sirens began to wail, faint at first, then growing louder. Harris had already been nearby with the bureau team, waiting for confirmation. Within minutes, the building was surrounded. By the time the agents stormed in, Ruth was standing over Novak, who lay coughing and half-blind, her face streaked with tears and pepper spray. Hale was pinned under Marcus, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Harris was the first through the door. He looked at Ruth, then at the two criminals, then back at Ruth again. "You really can't sit still, can you?" he muttered, shaking his head. Ruth's voice was steady. "I wasn't going to let them get away again." As the agents cuffed Hale and Novak, the warehouse lights flickered. Outside, the night air was thick with rain and flashing red and blue. Ruth stood under the awning, watching as they loaded the two doctors into separate cars. When Hale looked back at her through the window, his face was calm, almost curious. She met his gaze without blinking. For the first time in 16 years, she wasn't afraid. Harris joined her, his coat soaked, his expression somewhere between relief and awe. "You just helped take down one of the biggest organ trafficking rings this country's ever seen," he said. Ruth didn't smile. "I wasn't trying to take down a ring," she said. "I was trying to bury my daughter." He nodded slowly, understanding the weight in her words. The rain kept falling, soft and endless, washing the city clean or trying to. Ruth slipped her hand into her pocket, feeling the familiar curve of Alana's bracelet. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. It sounded like an ending, but also maybe the start of something new. The interrogation room smelled like cold air and fear. The walls were a dull gray, the kind that seemed to close in the longer you sat there. Under the harsh fluorescent light, Louis Romero hunched over the table, his face pale, eyes darting toward the door every few seconds as if someone might come through it to save him or kill him. Across from him, Agent Karen Duval sat still as stone, a digital recorder between them. Detective Leon Harris leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching every twitch of Romero's hands. He'd seen men like this before, small pieces of bigger monsters, people who thought they could live with what they'd done until the ghosts got too heavy. Tonight, those ghosts had come to collect. Romero's voice cracked when he spoke. "I told you everything," he said. "I gave you the names. I didn't kill her." Duval's tone stayed even. "You were part of the operation," she said. "You helped cover it up. You made the payments to the storage unit. You kept that freezer closed for 16 years. He flinched at the word freezer. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered. "Hale said if I didn't, my family would disappear." "You don't know what that man's capable of." Harris finally stepped forward. "Oh, I know exactly what he's capable of. What I don't know is why you kept paying all these years. Hale's been hiding for a decade, Novak too. You could have walked away." Romero's hands shook. "Walked away? You think you just walk away from people like them?" He looked up, eyes wet and desperate. "You don't. You survive them." Duval exchanged a glance with Harris. "Start from the beginning," she said. "How did you meet Jester Hale?" Romero wiped his face with trembling fingers. "He came to one of the job sites. This was back in '07. Said he needed a driver, someone discreet. Paid cash, good money. At first it was just deliveries, medical equipment, boxes sealed tight. Then one night he told me to pick someone up." He paused, swallowing hard. "Said she was a patient, needed transportation to the clinic. She looked so young. I told him it didn't feel right, and he just smiled and said, 'You worry too much. You re-helping science.'" His voice dropped to a whisper. "That girl's name was Alana." The room went silent. Even Duval, who'd heard more confessions than she could count, sat frozen for a beat. Romero's eyes filled again. "She was scared," he said. "Asked where her mama was. I told her she'd be fine, that it was just a checkup. Hale told me to wait outside. Couple hours later, Novak came out with a cooler. Said it was biological waste. I didn't know God. I didn't want to know, but I saw the blood on her shoes." He pressed his hands to his face. "They paid me to get rid of the waste. I did what they told me. I didn't look inside until later, when the smell got bad. Then I saw his breath hitched. She was just a kid." Harris's jaw clenched. Every detail matched what Ruth had already uncovered. But hearing it out loud was different. It made it real in a way that paperwork never could. Duval leaned forward. "You kept the storage unit under your name for years. Who told you to?" "Hale," Romero said. "He called me every few months from different numbers. Said he'd send money through a friend, that I needed to keep paying or they'd come looking for me." "Who's they?" Duval asked. Romero hesitated. "Buyers," he whispered. "People who paid for the organs. Big names, I think rich folks, some overseas." He said they had eyes everywhere. The confession went on for hours. He told them about the clinic's donor program, about how Hale used medical records to target patients who were young, healthy, and poor. He described the underground surgeries, the private flights out of Hartsfield, Jackson carrying transplant cargo. He said Novak handled the cutting, Hale handled the money, and he, the driver, handled the bodies. By the time he finished, Duval's notepad was full, and Harris's stomach felt hollow. "Why now?" Duval asked quietly. "Why tell us all this?" Romero's eyes dropped to the floor. "Because I saw her," he said. "The mother, Ruth. She came to the clinic. I saw her face when she found that file. That woman's not gonna stop. And maybe she shouldn't. Somebody needs to bury this right." Meanwhile, Ruth sat in another room down the hall, staring through the one weigh glass into the cell where Drar Victor Hale now sat. They'd arrested him only hours earlier, dragged him out of the warehouse in handcuffs, his calm composure cracking under the lights. His lawyer was already on the way, but Ruth didn't care about the legal part. She just wanted to see the man who had turned her daughter into a subject. The man who'd smiled at her once in a white coat and said, "She's doing great, Mrs. Walker." Hale looked up suddenly, as if sensing her presence on the other side of the glass. His expression didn't change much, no guilt, no fear. Just curiosity. He tilted his head slightly, like a scientist studying a specimen. Ruth's fists tightened at her sides. "You don't get to look at me," she whispered. "Not anymore." Detective Harris entered quietly, standing beside her. "He's not talking," he said. "Thinks he can stall long enough for his lawyer to pull him out on a technicality. But with Romero's confession, the evidence from the clinic, and your testimony, we've got him." Ruth didn't take her eyes off Hale. "Then make sure he never sees the light of day again." Later that night, in another interrogation room, Dr. Mila Novak sat with her wrists cuffed to the table. Her once perfect hair was a tangled mess, her face blotched from the pepper spray. She glared at the agents like they were insects. When Duval began questioning her, she smiled, a cold, brittle curve of her lips. "You think I did something wrong?" she said, her accent sharp. "I saved lives. Those organs went to people who needed them. Children, mothers, soldiers. Your country should be thanking me." Harris leaned forward. "You killed those kids. They were nothing," Novak spat. "They were gonna die anyway. Poor, sick, forgotten. At least now they meant something." Her voice carried no remorse, no shame. Just icy logic. Duval's tone didn't waver. "You operated on living children," she said. "You carved them up for profit." Novak shrugged. "And yet you sitting here judging me while your hospitals throw away usable organs every day. At least I didn't waste them." Harris felt something twist deep in his chest. He wanted to reach across the table and wipe that smug look off her face, but he forced himself to stay still. He'd seen monsters before, but none who believed their cruelty was mercy. When Ruth finally left the station, the night was nearly over. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining under the streetlights. She stood by her car, the air thick with the smell of wet asphalt. For the first time since the freezer had opened, she felt the faint stir of something that might be been peace, but it was fragile. Almost too fragile to hold. She thought about what Romero said about how he'd been scared, how he kept paying to keep the secret buried. She wondered how many more people had looked the other way. How many hands had taken money to keep her daughter lost. Justice, she realized, wasn't about one arrest. It was about unearthing the rot that had been allowed to grow for years. At home, she poured herself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bracelet she'd placed there days ago. The silver had dulled, but the engraving was still clear. Alana Walker, type 1 diabetes. Ruth ran her thumb over the letters. "You're free now," she said softly. "They can't hide you anymore." Outside, the first faint light of morning crept across the horizon. The world was still cruel, still indifferent, but something had shifted. The truth had finally surfaced, and it had her daughter's name written all over it. Across town, in a holding cell, Drar Victor Hale lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant clang of a door. For the first time in his life, the silence pressed back. He wasn't untouchable anymore. And in another cell down the hall, Mila Novak sat motionless, whispering something in her own language, over and over like a prayer or a curse. The storm that Ruth Walker had started was still spreading, and by the time it was done, there wouldn't be anywhere left for any of them to hide. The trial began 8 months later, in the thick heat of a Georgia summer. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing like lightning every time someone walked through the doors. The story had long since outgrown Atlanta. It was national now, another headline in the endless cycle of horror and outrage. The state of Georgia vs. Dr. Victor Hale and Dr. Mila Novak. The news called it the organ harvest case, as if it were some twisted business venture instead of a graveyard full of children. For Ruth Walker, it wasn't a headline. It was her daughter. It was 16 years of silence turned into noise so loud she could barely stand to hear it. She didn't want fame or pity. She wanted closure, and she wanted the world to say Alana's name the way it said, the names of every white child who went missing. On the first day of testimony, Ruth sat in the front row of the courtroom, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a simple black dress, the kind she'd worn to funerals. The courtroom buzzed with low whispers until the bailiff called for order. When Jector Victor Hale was led in, shackled but still trying to look dignified, the sound in the room seemed to drop away. He looked older now, thinner, but his arrogance hadn't aged a day. His gaze swept over the crowd and stopped on Ruth. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. He tilted his head slightly, a ghost of that same condescending smile she remembered from his office years ago. She didn't look away. Neither did he. Then the guard pulled him toward the defense table, and the moment was gone. The prosecution laid everything bare: records from Atlanta Medical Outreach, testimony from former employees, digital evidence recovered from old hard drives, and most damning of all, Luis Romero's confession. The courtroom listened in silence as the recording played. Romero's voice cracked over the speakers, describing how he'd lured Alana into the van, how Novak had prepped the operating room, how Hale had given the order to keep her under until extraction. The words hit Ruth like physical blows. She pressed her palms together so hard her knuckles turned white, refusing to cry where they could see her. Every sentence was a blade, and she took them all in silence. When it was her turn to testify, the air in the courtroom shifted. The judge, a woman with kind eyes and a firm voice, told her to take her time. Ruth stood, walked slowly to the stand, and swore in. Her hands shook as she adjusted the microphone. "My name is Ruth Walker," she began. Her voice was soft but steady. "I'm the mother of Alana Walker." The prosecutor asked her to tell the jury about her daughter, and for the first time in 16 years, Ruth spoke of her in the present tense. She told them about Alana's laugh, about how she used to hum gospel songs in the kitchen, about her dream of becoming a teacher. She told them how the police had dismissed her disappearance, how no one listened because her child was black and poor. Then she told them about the freezer, about opening it and finding her baby girl frozen in time. The courtroom was so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioner. When the defense attorney tried to cross-examine her, asking whether she had any personal bias against Drar Hale, Ruth turned to him and said quietly, "He cut open my daughter and sold her heart to a stranger. You tell me what kind of bias that earns." The judge didn't reprimand her. Nobody breathed. Hale's defense was predictably hollow. His lawyers argued that the clinic's records were falsified, that Hale had been framed by Novak and Romero, that he had no knowledge of what was happening under his roof. They called him a healer, a man of compassion. But when Agent Duval took the stand and presented the bank records, millions in offshore transfers tied to shell charities under Hale's name, the defense's case began to unravel. Novak's testimony destroyed whatever was left. Facing a lifetime sentence, she tried to save herself by turning on Hale. Her voice was cold as she described their arrangement, how he recruited patients from poor neighborhoods, how he paid her to harvest what they needed, how he called it the modern market of mercy. When the prosecutor asked if she felt remorse, Novak smiled thinly. "I did what I was trained to do," she said. "The world runs on supply and demand. I just filled the demand." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ruth felt the hair on her arms rise. There was no humanity in that woman's eyes, only calculation. When Hale was finally called to the stand, his arrogance cracked. For hours, he danced around questions, refusing to admit guilt. But under cross-examination, the prosecutor cornered him. "Mr. Hale," she said, "you claim to have cared about your patients. You claim to have saved lives. Yet we have DNA evidence linking your clinic's shipments to bodies found across 3 states. How do you reconcile that?" Hale hesitated just a fraction of a second too long. "I did what medicine has always done. he said. "I gave life to those who could afford it." That single sentence sealed his fate. Gasps filled the room. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "You heard it yourself," she said. "He didn't treat people, he priced them." The verdict came after only 6 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts of murder, conspiracy, human trafficking, medical fraud, obstruction of justice. When the judge read the sentence, life without parole, the room erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed. But Ruth didn't move. She sat still, staring at the man who had stolen her world. Hale looked back, expression blank, the kind of emptiness that comes when evil realizes it's finally been seen for what it is. Afterward, outside the courthouse, the air was heavy with humidity and noise. People pressed microphones toward Ruth, shouting her name, asking how it felt to win. She ignored them all. She wasn't there to win. She was there to make sure her daughter's name was spoken out loud in a room that once refused to see her. When a young black reporter finally asked softly, "What do you want people to remember about Alana?" Ruth stopped walking. "That she mattered," she said. "That she was here. And that the next time a black girl goes missing, maybe someone will look before it's too late." In the weeks that followed, the city seemed to breathe differently. There were murals painted in Alana's honor, bright colors, her smiling face surrounded by sunflowers. The mayor spoke about reform, about funding for missing persons cases in black communities. None of it brought her back, but it was something. Ruth met with families of other victims, women who'd lost children to the same system of neglect. Together, they formed the Alana Walker Foundation, providing legal and financial aid for families searching for missing loved ones. It wasn't charity, it was defiance. Detective Harris visited her one evening, a rare smile on his face. "You did it," he said quietly. "You got justice." Ruth looked out the window at the mural across the street, glowing orange in the sunset. "Justice is too small a word," she said. "I got truth, the rest is for God to handle." That night, when she finally returned home, Ruth lit a single candle by Alana's photo. The flickering flame danced across the bracelet beside it, the metal catching the light. She whispered her daughter's name once, twice, like a prayer. Outside, thunder rumbled again, distant but steady. The storm that had started in a forgotten storage unit had swept through the city, through courtrooms and hearts, leaving nothing untouched. Ruth closed her eyes and let the sound fill her. For the first time in 16 years, she didn't feel the cold anymore. The summer after the verdict, Atlanta began to breathe again. The trial had left the city raw, exposed in all the ways people preferred to ignore, but something new had taken root in that wound. People were talking, organizing, remembering. For once, the news didn't move on after the headlines faded. The Alana Walker Foundation had turned from an idea into a movement. Ruth Walker, who had once been dismissed as just another grieving mother, had become a voice too loud to ignore. She didn't ask for that role. It found her the same way grief had, slowly, then all at once. She still lived in the same small apartment, though her landlord had begged her to move somewhere safer after the media storm. The walls were lined with photos of Alana, some from childhood. Others the ones painted by local artists who'd turned her story into murals across the city. Ruth kept them close, not out of pain anymore, but out of duty. Every morning, she lit a candle by her daughter's photo before heading to the foundation office downtown. It was small, cramped, but alive. Volunteers came from all over, students, mothers, even former police officers who'd left the force disillusioned by what they'd seen. The foundation helped fund DNA testing for unidentified remains, offered legal aid for families of missing children, and partnered with community organizers in other cities. The work was endless, but it kept her hands from shaking and her nights from collapsing in on themselves. Detective Leon Harris visited often. He'd transferred to a special victims unit, helping reopen old cold cases, many of which had once been labeled runaways. Ruth teased him sometimes, calling him the one good cop left in Atlanta. He'd laugh and shake his head, but there was truth behind her words. Harris had changed too. Watching Ruth fight had stripped the last bit of bureaucracy out of him. You made believers out of cynics, he told her one afternoon as they looked over new case files. That's rarer than catching a killer. Ruth smiled faintly. You can't catch what the system won't chase. So we make them chase it. But not everything healed cleanly. The shadows of the past still followed her. She would wake some nights from dreams where she was back in that storage unit, the air cold enough to burn her lungs. She'd see the freezer lid open again, the frost, the light catching on Alana's bracelet. In those moments, she'd sit up and whisper into the dark, I'm still here, baby. And somehow that was enough to push the nightmares back. The Foundation's biggest victory came the following spring, when Kesha's law, named after Alana's middle name, passed through the Georgia legislature. The law required mandatory DNA testing for all unidentified remains and created a statewide task force for missing black and brown women and children. The bill had been written with the help of Harris and Agent Duval. But it was Ruth who stood in front of the cameras when the governor signed it. She didn't smile for the photos. Her eyes carried too much history for that. This law won't bring my daughter back, she said to the reporters. But it might stop another mother from living my story. And that's enough. Afterward, she drove to the cemetery where Alana was buried, a quiet plot beneath a magnolia tree. The stone was simple: Alana K. Walker, beloved daughter, forever remembered. The sun filtered through the leaves, scattering patches of gold across the grass. Ruth knelt beside the grave, tracing her fingers over the name. We did it, she whispered. You were changing the world, even from here. The breeze lifted, carrying the scent of the magnolias. It felt like an answer. In the months that followed, Ruth became something of a reluctant symbol. Universities invited her to speak about justice reform. Churches asked her to share her testimony. She didn't talk about the horror much anymore. People already knew that part. Instead, she spoke about persistence, about how truth was not a miracle but a muscle, one you had to keep working even when it hurt. She reminded crowds that her daughter's story wasn't rare, it was just the one someone finally cared enough to see. There are still freezers out there, she told them once, her voice low and unwavering. Not all of them hold bodies. Some hold evidence. Some hold silence, but they were all locked the same way. We have to open every one of them. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Ruth returned home to find a small envelope slipped under her door. No return address, just her name written in neat cursive. Her first instinct was caution. Years of fear had trained her to expect danger. But when she opened it, she found a letter written on thick paper, the handwriting elegant and precise. It was from Luis Romero, sent from federal prison. The letter was short. He wrote that he was cooperating with authorities, giving them more names, more connections, trying to make things right in the only way he knew how. I can't undo what I did, he wrote, but I want your daughter's name to mean something in the record books. I want her to be the one who ended this. Ruth read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it beside Alana's photo. Maybe you finally did one good thing, she said quietly. Meanwhile, Hale and Novak's names disappeared from the headlines, swallowed by new scandals and tragedies. They were both serving life sentences in separate federal facilities, no parole, no contact. But every now and then, Ruth would get a letter from another grieving mother, someone who'd lost a child years ago and finally found answers because of the investigation that started with that freezer. Those letters were her real verdict. On the anniversary of the discovery, the day she'd opened the storage unit, Ruth returned to the place where it had all begun. The unit was empty now, the walls scrubbed clean, the metal door rusted at the edges. The storage company had offered to tear it down, but she'd asked them not to. Some things need to stay standing, she'd said. That evening, she stood inside with Marcus and Harris. They placed a small plaque on the wall, in memory of the ones who were lost but found their way home. Ruth stepped back, staring at the words. This is where she was, she said softly. But it's not where she stays. They left the door open as the sun went down. The light spilled inside, turning the cold metal walls warm for the first time. Ruth stood there for a long time after the others had gone, her silhouette framed against the fading sky. She thought about all the years she'd spent chasing a whisper, about how grief had carved her down to something sharper, something unbreakable. The city outside buzzed with life, cars, laughter, music from a distant bar, but inside the unit, it was still, peaceful. Before she left, Ruth placed Alana's bracelet on a small hook inside the storage unit. It gleamed faintly in the dying light. "You're free now," she whispered again, the same words she'd spoken after the trial. "And so am I." Then she closed the door, not to lock it, but to leave it resting. The way you close a chapter when you're finally ready to turn the page. Driving home through the warm summer air, Ruth rolled down the windows. The city smelled like rain and honeysuckle. Somewhere, a church bell rang. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Grief had become something else now, a companion, not a cage. The radio hummed low, a gospel song drifting through the speakers, one Alana used to sing. Ruth joined softly under her breath, her voice steady, sure. For the first time in 16 years, the sound didn't echo back hollow. It filled the car, the night, the city itself, like a prayer finally answered. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between the notes, Ruth swore she could hear her daughter's laughter, light, familiar, and endless. The story of Ruth Walker and her daughter Alana isn't just a tale of tragedy, it's a mirror held up to the quiet, invisible violence that lives in the margins of America. It's about how systems built to protect can also abandon, how justice can sleep while grief stays wide awake. At its heart, it's a story about a black mother who refused to be silenced in a world that has always asked women like her to sit down, to move on, to let it go. Ruth's journey from despair to defiance is more than one woman's fight for her child. It's a map of what it takes to claw truth out of indifference, to dig justice from the cold earth with your bare hands. The first lesson this story teaches is that silence is not peace. For 16 years, Ruth lived inside a silence so heavy it nearly became her. The police stopped calling, the neighbors stopped asking, and the world moved on. But grief doesn't move on, it roots itself in your bones until it becomes action. Ruth's decision to buy that forgotten storage unit wasn't coincidence. It was the universe bending under the weight of her persistence. It's a reminder that when institutions fail, love still hunts for answers. A mother's love is an act of rebellion, especially when the world refuses to see her pain as worthy of justice. Ruth didn't wait for permission to look for her daughter. She made her own permission, one sleepless night at a time. But the story doesn't only belong to Ruth, it belongs to the countless families who never get their day in court. The missing black girls epidemic in America is real and ongoing, and it reveals something dark about the nation's conscience. When white children go missing, their faces fill the news. When black or brown children disappear, their stories fade before the ink dries. Ruth's fight exposes that double standard, forcing society to confront the question it keeps dodging: whose lives are worth searching for? Her story screams an answer the headlines won't say out loud, that justice should not be color-coded, that a human life is not measured by how much empathy it can buy. Then there's the lesson about power, how it hides behind titles, white coats, and good manners. Drar. Victor Hale was a symbol of everything people are taught to trust: educated, articulate, respected. He used that trust like a weapon. His clinic was dressed in the language of compassion, outreach, care, donation, but beneath it was rot. It's a warning that evil doesn't always snarl or show its teeth. Sometimes it wears a stethoscope and smiles while it writes prescriptions. The story forces us to question the systems we trust blindly: healthcare, law enforcement, charity. It asks whether these institutions truly serve everyone, or just those who can afford to be seen. Ruth's confrontation with Hale is the story's spiritual center. She doesn't come to him as a victim, she comes as judgment. For years he saw her daughter as a resource, not a person. But when Ruth stands in that warehouse, looking him in the eye, she strips away every layer of power he built around himself. She reminds him and us that dignity isn't granted by credentials or status. It's born out of love and pain and the refusal to bow. In that moment, Ruth reclaims her daughter's humanity and her own. It's a moment of holy reckoning, where faith meets fury. There's also a quieter, subtler lesson woven through the story. Redemption isn't loud. It doesn't come from the courts, or the cameras, or the politicians who show up when it's convenient. It comes from people like Ruth and Harris and Marcus, ordinary folks who choose to act even when it costs them. Harris's transformation from wary detective to believer mirrors Ruth's own journey. He begins as a man trained to follow procedure, to let the system dictate the pace of justice. But Ruth's fire forces him to see what he'd stopped looking at: the humanity behind the case files. Through her, he learns that justice isn't a process, it's a choice you make every day not to turn away. When the truth finally comes out, when the doctors are sentenced and the city starts to remember Alana's name, it would be easy to call it closure. But the story refuses that comfort. Ruth doesn't find peace in punishment, she finds it in purpose. The creation of the Alana Walker Foundation and the passing of Kesha's law turn her grief into motion, her loss into law. It's the story of a woman who takes the worst thing that ever happened to her and transforms it into something that protects others. That's the truest kind of victory, the kind that leaves behind more than a headline. The lesson stretches beyond Ruth's life, into the collective one we share. It reminds us that justice isn't just about catching villains, it's about dismantling the conditions that let them thrive. The same neglect that let hail prey on vulnerable children is the same neglect that lets missing person cases for Black girls go cold. Ruth's story demands that we look at those cracks in our society and stop pretending they're just accidents. They're patterns we keep repeating until someone like Ruth breaks them. At its core, the story teaches that healing and vengeance are not the same thing. Ruth doesn't kill Hala, she exposes him. She doesn't burn down the world that failed her, she forces it to look at itself. That's harder. It's easy to destroy, it's harder to stay, to rebuild, to make sure the truth lives longer than the pain. Her victory isn't loud or cinematic, it's quiet, stubborn, enduring. It's the sound of a mother lighting a candle every morning and whispering her daughter's name like a prayer. And maybe that's the deepest lesson: love, even broken and bloodied, is stronger than evil. Not the kind of love that forgives monsters, but the kind that builds something unbreakable in the ashes they leave behind. Ruth's love didn't end when Alana died, it evolved. It turned into justice, into law, into a foundation that carries her daughter's voice where she can no longer speak. Through Ruth, we learn that love isn't fragile, it's relentless. It's what keeps the world turning when everything else stops. In the end, a mother bought a storage unit isn't really about death, it's about resurrection. It's about how truth, even when frozen, can thaw. How a name whispered long enough can echo through a city until it becomes a movement. The story reminds us that every act of courage, no matter how small, sends ripples outward. Ruth's fight doesn't erase the horror that came before, but it transforms it. She turns a freezer, a symbol of death and silence, into a doorway toward justice. If there's one lesson to carry from her story, it's this: grief doesn't have to end in darkness. It can light the way for others. The world changes not because heroes appear, but because ordinary people refuse to stop loving in a place that has forgotten how. Ruth Walker didn't just find her daughter, she found the truth. And in doing so, she gave that truth back to everyone still waiting in the dark, whispering the names of the lost, believing that one day, someone will finally listen. If you enjoy stories that make you think twice before turning off the lights, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are still many things left unsaid, and we'll continue exploring them together.